The following sequence of video lectures have been created to support Introduction to Public Health at Orange Coast College. In this unit, we will look at non-communicable diseases and their impact on public health, including the burden of disease and how we can minimize that burden. In the first half of our class, we looked at many factors that can impact health outcomes, and we called these the determinants of health. The authors of our textbook, Dr. Riggleman and Kirkman, gave us the mnemonic Big GEMS to help us remember the different types of determinants. If you recall, Big GEMS stands for biology, infection, genetics, geography, environment, medical care, and socioeconomic status. We took some time and looked at the determinants in a variety of different situations and scenarios. However, the determinants are not the actual cause of death. They are merely contributing factors. The actual causes of death or disability can be categorized as environmental disease and injury, communicable disease, and non-communicable disease. Let's look at what these entail. This slide represents findings from a 2000 CDC study that compared leading causes of death, such as heart disease, with actual causes of death, for example, physical activity, smoking, or poor diet. I apologize for the age of this study, but it has not been replicated since, so I don't have a more current set of data. The study noted that nearly half of all causes of death that occurred in the United States could be attributed to a handful of largely preventable exposures and behaviors, such as tobacco use, poor diet, and physical inactivity. Together, heart disease, cancer, stroke, chronic lower respiratory disease, and diabetes account for 2/3 of all death. So improving healthy behaviors and healthy living community-wide can play an important role in preventing and reducing the consequences of chronic diseases. Note that if the increased trends of overweight is not reversed over the next decade, poor diet and physical inactivity will likely overtake tobacco as the leading preventable cause of death. As we go through this chapter, we will look at non-communicable diseases, followed by communicable and then environmental diseases and injuries. And we will look at the causes of death in terms of determinants. Again, the determinants would be things like the behaviors or the exposures as opposed to the actual disease that caused death. With non-communicable diseases, we're looking at things like tobacco use, diet, physical inactivity, alcohol use, and illicit drugs. This is not an all-inclusive list, just to give you an idea of what we'll be looking at. With communicable diseases, which are infectious diseases, we'll be looking at infectious agents like microbial agents, germs, viruses, bacteria, and then also behaviors such as sexual behavior. Environmental diseases and injuries are looking at toxic agents and exposure to these toxic agents, along with other environmental issues, things related to motor vehicle accidents and firearm-related injuries. Again, these lists are not all inclusive, but just here to give us an idea of what we're looking at. When we look at deaths by broad cause group, we find that there's a difference when we look at developed regions as opposed to developing regions. Generally, we talk about countries, developed countries versus developing countries, although if you look within the United States, you will find that this broad cause group can be applied to regions within the United States. And as you look at these two pie charts, you probably will notice that in developed regions, 77% of deaths are caused by non-communicable diseases, which is the reddish purple. Whereas in developing regions, the majority of deaths are caused by the lavender, which is the communicable diseases. In developing nations, we find infectious diseases to be the greatest burden of disease. Infectious diseases can be treated with antibiotics, but quite often the population cannot afford the medication to control the disease. In developed nations, we have the resources to battle infectious diseases, and so what we find, because of the comforts of living, diseases and death can be attributed to lifestyle diseases, such as inactivity, poor diet, things like smoking. This is called the epidemiological transition, and we talked about this briefly in the first chapter. So, the major cause of death and disability in developed countries is generally non-communicable diseases, whereas the major cause of death and disability in developing are communicable diseases. The epidemiological transition illustrates that causes of death are based on socioeconomic status. Let's take a look at the World Health Organization and their report of the top 10 causes of death. If you look globally, here is a bar graph, and notice that the red denotes communicable disease, the blue is non-communicable, and then the green indicates injuries. So globally, it's non-communicable diseases that's the major cause of death. You can see the top 3 bars are blue, followed by a red, number 4, lower respiratory infections. Then if we look at leading cause of death by economic group, notice what happens with our low income. The top 2 are red, are infectious diseases, followed by ischemic. And as we move up in the socioeconomic status ranges, you can see that the blue, the non-communicable, starts to overtake the red, which is communicable. This is that epidemiological transition that we're talking about. And as we move to upper middle class, notice that the red is now number 6, lower respiratory infections. And then here it's still number 6 in the high income. So this is what we're talking about in terms of the socioeconomic status impacting health and the epidemiological transition. I've been using the term non-communicable disease quite a bit during this lecture, and I want to make sure you all understand what I'm talking about. We're talking about lifestyle or chronic diseases. In kinesiology and physical education, we called these hypokinetic diseases. Hypo meaning under or low, kinetic meaning motion. So diseases, as we would view it, caused by inactivity. They develop over time, and some familiar examples, again, are cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression, Alzheimer's, and chronic arthritis. So these are diseases that are not passable, meaning if I have cardiovascular disease, if you're around me, you're not going to get it directly. You might get it because you follow my behaviors and you eat junk food and aren't active, but not directly like you have with infectious diseases. So non-communicable diseases represent a wide range of diseases. The implications of non-communicable diseases relate both to mortality and morbidity, along with economics. Related to mortality and morbidity, these diseases represent the major cause of death and disability in the developed countries, as we've discussed. Today, cardiovascular disease and cancer alone represent nearly 25% of the causes of death, as reflected in death certificates in the United States. The impact of non-communicable diseases on death only reflects part of the influence of these diseases on people's lives. Chronic disability, largely due to non-communicable diseases, are now the most rapidly growing component of morbidity in the developing as well as developed countries. And as our population ages, these lifestyle diseases will increase in frequency. The presence of 2 or more chronic diseases makes progressive disability particularly likely. The economic implications include the consequences of the rapidly growing pattern of disability due to these diseases and their impact on the economy. They have huge economic implications. The greatest increase in direct costs for healthcare is in part due to the increased burden of non-communicable and lifestyle diseases. the impact extends beyond healthcare costs, as it affects the quality of life and may limit the ability of those who wish to work to continue to do so. When looking at chronic disease, there are challenges. When we talk about preventing a disease, that requires us to understand the etiology, the cause of the disease, and we've talked about this when we looked at PERIE. Chronic diseases are more difficult to understand because there's not a single pathogen or germ that causes them, whereas with AIDS or with the flu or other infectious diseases, we can identify a germ, a bacteria, a virus that causes them. That's not the case with these lifestyle diseases. Lifestyle diseases generally have multiple causes. So obesity, which actually is a symptom of behaviors such as inactivity, poor diet, these things, and I say that knowing that there is a genetic link to obesity, there's not a single cause of the symptom of obesity. It's generally a variety of factors. Also, with lifestyle diseases, they develop over a long period of time, which then complicates as pinpointing the direct cause. However, because they do develop over a lifetime, this gives us some ability to screen and to do risk factor analysis. And with the data that we get from these tools, we can try to provide intervention to reduce people's risk of developing the diseases.